we'll go through the minutes and the formal matters of the meeting, and then we'll get on quickly to the discussion and the review of the strategy. So I've not had any notices for absence or substitutions. I've had no notice of that. So we'll move on. I've had no notices of urgent matters. So we've got the agenda as it was published, and there's no notice of any matters to be considered in private. The next item on the agenda is declarations of interest. The discussions tonight may possibly discuss low traffic neighbourhoods. I live close or near a low traffic neighbourhood, although I don't think it has an impact on the value of my home. So I declare that just so that it's on the record there. So are there any other declarations of interest?
Yep, I declare that I'm working on themes related to climate change.
All right, thank you very much. And no other declarations? So if we now go into the minutes of the last meeting, we previously, when we met, we were constituted as panel 3. We're now panel 4, and we have the minutes for panel 4 with us this evening. So we're in the odd position of approving minutes for a committee that we weren't a member of, but because we are now panel 4, it's a quirk of procedure that the minutes follow the panel rather than follow the members. So I have gone to Democratic Services to clarify that. So it's a bit difficult for us to comment on a minutes or raise issues from when we weren't there, but I present it to the meeting just to...
What have Democratic Services said? Because none of us served on that meeting, so we can't honestly pass it as a true and correct record.
Councillor Young, I agree. And I raised that exact point. And the procedural point was put to me that the members of the committee, the minutes follow the meeting rather than follow the members. I agree that point. When I went to, I gave my comments to the panel 3 that had our minutes from the previous meeting to correct a couple of points or clarify a couple of points. So as chair, I wrote into that meeting to do that. I don't think there's any notes. They would have come in the briefing note from the chair of the previous meeting to review the minutes and offer comments. I agree with your points.
They ought really to be agreed by OSC.
They can come back up to OSC. That could be our recommendation for them.
I think that ought to be our recommendation.
I wouldn't disagree. How did you want to?
Well, the OSC received all the draft minutes of the first meetings for all the review panels on the 8th of October, and the chairs of all the panels were at that meeting. And any changes that were flagged up at that stage have been incorporated, and the respective chair of that panel has agreed these.
Okay, so if OSC has agreed them, we don't need to agree them.
Okay, I'm happy to accept that. We can note we've received them. We're in an odd position because of how COVID has impacted the constitution of committees this year. We've kind of transitioned from one year to another year, so there's a bit of a quirk this year. Whereas previous years we would have been reconstituted, so there is a bit of an anomaly there, just to put it into context and people can understand. Is everybody agree with that? Because OSC, which is the overseeing review and scrutiny committee, has received them. Are people in agree with proceeding under that understanding? On my screen, I can see lots of people nodding, so I'm going to say I accept that as agreeing to go forward with that.
Chair.
Thank you very much. There is the panel operations, and that has the outline for the future meetings. There was a pre-meeting with myself and Councillor Buttersill and officers to look at potential themes for the future meeting as well. The themes that were chosen were about food, because that could be part of the scrutiny and help with the delivery of the programme, and then about energy. So in the briefing note for the meeting, I wrote to everybody yesterday just to sort of flag this up. Now, at the end of the meeting, perhaps we might review that. It's a bit difficult to do that here and now without going through that discussion, but I want to raise that. That's why those points were on that as agenda, because the result of a preliminary meeting prior to this. So we had some steer for office to think about where we were going forward. Is that okay? Is everybody agreed with that, just proceeding under that basis? So if you want to change that at the end of the meeting, we could always come back, but I just sort of flag that up now. Is that okay for everyone?
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah.
Too.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So we're now onto the substantive part of the meeting, which is the climate, ecology and emergency strategy. So that's what we will be going through for this meeting now. We have several external participants. So I'd like to welcome Mary Horash. Mary's being active in climate, environmental work locally, and took part in the sort of panel assembly that Ealing had to help to develop the policy. Trevor Sharman, who is involved with Ealing Transition, which is a local group in Ealing that is involved in the environment and ecology locally and has run various projects in the borough, covering anything from solar power to public meetings and information. And Peter Miners, who's from Ealing Cycling Campaign, who's got a background in transport planning. So we have 3 external participants, and we have Joe Mattison, who's the officer who's written the report tonight as well. So if I hand over to Joe, who's going to go through the initial outline. My recommendation is to the meetings that we try and segment the meeting, because there are 4 themes in the report. So I think it would be good to try and just chunk the meeting into 4 parts, just rather than one whole expansive discussion, because that will have a very long introduction. So it might just be easier to keep some of the themes. Trevor and Mary wanted to come in at the initial part to give a bit of a background as well in their context. So we're just going to be mindful that we've got sort of 4 segments to the report, and then a final section was about involvement and participation as well. So I would suggest that that's how I'd like to structure the meeting, just so we can be a bit more consistent in how we reflect in each theme. Is that okay for everyone? Okay, so if I pass over to Joe, over to you, Joe. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. If you just bear with me while I share my screen here, I've got a few slides prepared. I'm going to have to make one more adjustment here. Okay. So thank you very much for the opportunity to present to the scrutiny panel tonight. This is timed perfectly for some sort of last minute input into the finalization of the strategy, which will be going through its final iterations in the next couple of days as we make our way through the cabinet process, so that we can hopefully be adopted in the January cabinet meeting. My report tonight focused on setting the context, really, and then I also provided a working draft of the strategy, which it has evolved since then, but it's a good indication of where we've landed with the strategy. So I just wanted to start tonight with actually the UK context, and this comes directly from the report that was submitted to the panel. And the reason for including this contextual side of things was so that we can understand how Ealing's strategy sort of came to be, and that we are in fact complementing what's going on nationally and regionally. So the Climate Change Act of 2008 is what gives us our steer as a country on what we're doing around climate change. And most recently, last summer, we adopted a sort of further legislation so that we adopted a 2050 carbon neutral target as a nation. And as part of the amendment, I believe, to that target being adopted, they also asked that a UK climate assembly was created, and that brought together 100 members of the public, which was meant to be sort of a selection of all walks of life in the country. And they would come together, learn about ideas around climate change, and their the main purpose of the group was to help the government or to inform the government on how we get to a carbon neutral position as a nation. And so they grappled with these points that are on the screen now. And you can see what I've put in brackets is sort of how this maps back to the strategy that we've developed. And just to note, in the middle of the screen, there's 2 items around food and embodied carbon. And those are 2 areas that are future developments for our strategy, just due to capacity issues and due to the real desire to bring the public into those discussions. We have sort of earmarked those for future delivery, and we've focused on the other aspects, which I'll get into in just a moment. The London context gives us, we work with sort of 2 guiding documents around that. So we've got the London Environment Strategy, which is a mega document, hundreds of pages long and covering all types of environmental policy for the city. And you can see, again, with that, that's in the left-hand corner of your screen now. And you can see with that how we sort of are able to mirror and draw in themes that are dealt with in that strategy, whether that's directly, as in we have themes of our strategy that are named that, or indirectly in the case of air quality, for instance, where that would be picked up as a co-benefit of addressing carbon emissions. And you can also see that London has come up with a second sort of complementary strategy, which is their 1.5 degrees Celsius compatibility plan. And so that really takes them into the carbon emissions space. So their environment plan is more of a broad environmental sustainability policy document, and the 1.5 degree compatibility plan is about the carbon emission side of things. So you can see that the recommendations in that report are very much around energy efficiency and the burning of fossil fuels, really, for our power sources. So that sort of gives you a little bit of contextualization of how we've drawn together the themes that we chose to focus on as a local authority, and where we felt like we had the most control and influence over our locality. You also see in the paper that I've got 4 key questions that have been put to the panel. And I don't know if we want to delve into those right now, but maybe they're just ones that we keep in mind as we work through the slides for tonight. I'll take a lead from the chair as to how and when we address those, whether that's formally or this is just a guide for how we think through the presentation tonight. But that's sort of a context setter. And over the last several months, 18 months, I believe, we've been working on the development of our own local strategy. So that's our climate emergency, climate and ecological emergency strategy. So in April of 2019, we had a unanimous decision by full council to declare a climate emergency for the borough. And we've been bringing reports back to Cabinet intermittently over the following months to get to a point where we were able to share a draft strategy in May, which we then took out for further consultation with our residents and other stakeholders. That we've done some refinements recently, and as I said, we're on target to deliver the strategy for January. I think it's important to go back to what the declaration is actually saying. So the declaration itself was a climate emergency declaration, and it's something that I believe I read today, I think I put it in the strategy today, that 90% of the population of Britain are now governed by a locality that has declared a climate emergency. So it's become a very, very big movement globally, not just in the UK. And our climate emergency focused on becoming carbon neutral by 2030. And we were ambitious in that not only are we becoming carbon neutral as an organization, as a council, but we're also declaring that we will become carbon neutral as a borough, so our geography, all of the people and businesses within the borough. And we're also going further in taking account for what's called the production and consumption emissions of the borough. So a shorthand for that, it could be an imperfect shorthand, but a shorthand for that is that production emissions you can think of as when we burn fossil fuels to heat our homes, heat our hot water, power our motor vehicles. So that would be what's considered produced emissions. And those are emissions that are happening inside the borders of our borough. And consumed emissions, as a shorthand, would be things that every object in your life represents really an entire journey to your hands, basically. So that's whether that is agricultural or mining, being extracted from the ground, journeying to be refined into something, being manufactured into the item, being transported, being packaged. All of that represents a compounding of carbon emissions that are embodied by that item. And so our climate emission, our climate emergency declaration talks about becoming an aim of becoming carbon neutral in relation to those consumed emissions as well. So this is a pretty enormous remit. But our strategy, first of all, we've expanded our remit slightly because we felt like an ecological emergency is sort of, you can't sort of look at one without looking at the other. And we feel like that is just as important as the carbon emission side of the equation for Ealing. So we've tied the two together. And so it is a climate and an ecological emergency that we're addressing with the strategy. And you will see in the strategy that we are mainly focused at this time on working with our produced emissions within the borough. And again, you'll see in the strategy, you'll note in the strategy that we are mainly right now in this iteration working on, as an organization, what we have direct control and direct influence over. So the data that we work with is drawn from BEIS, which is a central government organization. That is the Business, Energy, and Industrial Strategy department. And so they produce the data set. They produce it annually, but they're always 2 years behind. So the most recent data that we have is from 2018. And so therefore that is the data that we are using to set our baseline for becoming carbon neutral. So the pie that you see in front of me, I hope it's clear to everyone. It's quite neat in that we can see three dominant segments there. We have transport, domestic energy, and then industry and commercial. And it's roughly in thirds there. And that helps us kind of understand where our focus can be as an organization, because we have a lot of excellent control over how transport occurs in the borough, and also a lot of influence around the domestic energy side of things. And you can see there as well what our estimates for the borough-wide emissions are, which is just over 1 million tons annually. And that breaks down just as an even split across our population of each of us contributing about 3.3 tons per person each year. Our strategic approach to developing the strategy sort of looks at what I've alluded to earlier about how we control, what we directly influence, and then what we have indirect influence over. So as I said, this first piece of the strategy is really about the green bits that are on your screen. So the center, the control features, and the direct influence. And then future versions of our strategy will be more reaching out to that indirect influence sphere. I'm going to go into those in just a little bit more detail now so you have an understanding of what we mean by each of those segments. So by control, we mean council buildings and council activities. So if you think about how we purchase our energy, or how we maintain our buildings, or power our buildings, for instance. So we feel like we need to get this right. We have every possibility to get this piece right. The next piece is around direct influence. So you start to see more of the policy aspects coming in. So our planning policies, how we spend our money, what our financial activity looks like, and what our overarching policies are for the council. So this is the direct influence sphere. And then the indirect, this is the tough bit, but the most critical bit, because it really brings in everyone else. So the council, we haven't had this, I should be clear, we haven't had this study done for Ealing, but we have borrowed the work of our neighbors, which they've had some studies done to talk about if the council itself addressed its carbon emissions, and we were to get to a point where we were carbon neutral ourselves, or a zero carbon organization, what percentage of carbon emissions would that potentially be for as a proportion of the entire borough? And most local authorities in London were looking at something like 5 to 10% of carbon emissions are actually coming from the local authority itself. And so you can imagine that that leaves 95% that are sitting in this big sphere of direct influence and indirect influence, really. And so those are really important aspects for us to focus on in the future. But as a first iteration of our strategy, like I said, we've really gotten a handle on our control and direct influence with an aspiration towards working on this indirect influence aspect. And this just sets us up for further discussion later tonight, but I just wanted to give everyone a bit of the architecture of how we've set up the strategy, just so that everyone understands the flow of how we've worked through developing the strategy. So for the themes, I've actually missed off putting the themes up here, but for the themes that we've chosen to focus up on, they're energy, nature, travel, and waste. So we've chosen 4 themes, which, as I said, sort of map back to both the local and national work that's being done on climate change, and also where we feel like we have a great deal of influence. So for each of those themes, we've created a vision, which is the big idea. We've created objectives. We've kept it to 3 objectives for each of the themes. And that's sort of, you can think of that as maybe the way that the boat is pointed. So that's our direction that we hope to go in and what we hope to achieve. And then we've set targets for each of those objectives. And those targets are sort of the numeric way that we're going to measure whether or not we're sort of roughly getting towards those objectives that we set out to achieve. And then we've got action plans for each of those objectives, actually. So that's sort of the map of how each piece of the strategy works. And that will make a lot more sense if you've had a look at the draft strategy, or as we work through tonight, I've got some highlights of the strategy to share with you at a later point. So I'm going to hand this back over to the chair.
You're on mute, Paul.
It's not as if I've never done this before. Thank you, Joe, for your presentation. Thank you. Mary and Trevor wanted to come in and say several points about their understanding of the strategy and their involvement, and give their points. So I'm going to invite them to come in now, and then we're going to start to look at some of the themes in the strategy. Peter is going to come in a bit later when we're looking at transport. So Mary, do you want to start first?
Yeah, I can do. I've got something that I'll read out to you. Thank you for inviting me to present at this committee. I've been in environmental campaigning for many years and set up Ealing Repair Cafe, and am part of Ealing Transition. So I was pleased to be able to be part of this citizen review. I was delighted when Ealing Council pledged to tackle the climate change emergency, but now becomes the hard part of setting a strategy with targets within the Ealing Borough. I can see a lot of what we raised in the citizen review has been taken on board when comparing this new 45-page document to the 8-page document we reviewed. The document now explains its purpose and reasoning behind it, which is a significant improvement. But I find the introduction a bit wordy, and it'd be useful to break up the text with some bullet points and diagrams. But the next section, again, is a great balance of text and diagrams. I noticed that the scope of the strategy has increased, not just from the direct control. I think that's what Joe was saying about and now it's more on the influence side as well. This is significant as it'll have a greater impact on because of it's been included. Also, for the section of the objectives have been expanded and now has a 2-year plan that's making it so much easier to measure these objectives. The visions, when we were doing the consultation, were also problematic for us because they were it was that they weren't very forward thinking, but now they are much better. But as always, there's always more that could be done, and sometimes it looks more at the stepping stones than towards the aim. The co-benefits I really like that's included, and it's of crucial importance in getting change in society, as these changes are going to be difficult for some, and all the strategies should relate back to what the co-benefits for society as a whole. One of my major concerns with the plan was that there was a lot of planning strategy under all the sections and should be included in the local development plan. I've looked now at these documents, the new one, and I think there's been some sort of connection between the plan and this one, so I think that should continue. I've got some specific points for each section as well, which I'll bring up as we go through the document. For the rollout of the strategy, I really hope that the council will engage with a wider audience in the Ealing community. If there's something to be learnt from the LTN implementation across London, it's that people need and want to feel like they have some say in the democratic process. Implementing these changes to mitigate climate change is going to require lifestyle changes for us all, which will not always be easy, and we need to communicate with everyone the benefits of these changes. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you. And please, if we come in back, feed that thread through about involvement and participation. I think that's really important. And we have a point at the end as well to try and bring those threads together as well. Yeah. So, Trevor, would you like to come in now and give us your opinions and thoughts on how the strategy is developing? Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much for inviting me. I'm involved with Ealing Transition Initiative, part of the steering group, and have been so since its inception about 11 years ago. So on behalf of Ealing Transition Initiative, I welcome and applaud the development of this draft climate and ecological emergency strategy, to which we have contributed through public awareness raising and consultation events. Whilst it may not be perfect, to us it demonstrates commitment and leadership by the council administration and staff in recognising and responding to the climate and ecological emergencies. These are emergencies which are insidiously developing year by year, not in the dramatic way of the COVID pandemic, yet they will certainly cause much greater damage to our lives and communities even than COVID-19. In the autumn of 2018, the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change published its starkest report yet on the need for us all to reduce our carbon gas emissions to zero within 12 years if we were to avoid the catastrophic impacts of a global temperature rise of over 1.5 degrees centigrade. The UN Ecosystem Report of 2019 exposed the catastrophic declines in natural systems upon which all life on Earth depends, and declared a decade of action on ecosystem restoration. These reports describe the challenge we must address at all levels. The graph on page 17 of this draft strategy shows what a challenge this will be for us in Ealing. It shows that by 2030, even with the full implementation of this strategy, we will have reduced emissions locally by 30% and only by 45% by 2050. Even the most optimistic best case scenario shows just 50% reduction by 2030 and 80% by 2050. As the draft strategy states, and as Joe was saying earlier, the council and the locality only has limited control over carbon emissions, with up to 85% of consumed emissions occurring outside London. Much of this consumption will need to be reduced and decarbonised if we are to close the huge gap between what is needed and what the draft strategy intends to deliver. So, how to address this gap? Well, we've heard intimations of what that needs to be. We believe that the council must take a strong leadership role within this community and beyond, by effectively resourcing its own practical programs and by inspiring and leading the community to come together to act to support and create the deeper changes necessary to avoid the worst impacts from climate chaos, and to build community resilience and ownership through enabling us to act in support of ourselves. So we as a local community group remain committed to working with others to build this community network in support of effective local action to address the climate and ecological emergencies. So our watchword would be inclusion, engagement, ownership by the community. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Trevor. Thank you very much for coming in, and thank you for the work that Ealing Transition does for many years in Ealing. We've had the introductions to the overall. Joe, can I just ask you, did you have any specific points? Because if we go through the themes like energy, nature, travel and waste, and then have one about engagements finally, do you have any particular points, any themes that you want to mention about energy, just to introduce that section now? Yeah.
Absolutely. So what I've done is I've pulled just to focus the mind a bit, if I can get my head on screen sharing again. Great. To focus the mind, I've pulled the objectives for the energy piece here. Get my mouse to work. And as I said, so we've got an overall vision, which is in the strategy document that I've shared with the panel, but I just pulled out the objectives because we chose to keep it to 3 objectives for each theme to keep it relatively accessible for people. So specifically for councillors, if you wanted to know the 3 things that we're going to do around energy, it's these 3 things. So our commitments and our objectives around energy are that we future-proof all of the existing building stock so that it's energy efficient and it's high energy performance. We also are making a commitment that all of the new buildings in the borough are going to be achieving 0 carbon standards so that we don't keep creating or contributing to the problem going forward. And our third one is that we're investing in renewable energy because we find that to be an essential piece of the picture, or a piece of the puzzle of decarbonization. So I just thought I would put these 3 objectives here. If councillors or other members that are attending tonight have any discussion points specifically about the energy chapter of the strategy as it was when you received that, I'd be happy to take questions about that, or if there's a general discussion about sort of if we have this right, if this is the right level of ambition and scope, that could be helpful. Oh, you're on mute still.
Thank you. If we go to have a discussion of this theme now, just for any members of the public that are watching, there is a chat function. So if we're referring to that, that's where sometimes issue about the administration or the organisation of the meeting might be mentioned. We don't use that as a side discussion forum. So it's just if somebody needs to speak or raise a point, we might refer to a chat function, but it's not for an offline discussion. I'd also like to welcome Councillor Martin, who joined us a little late. She had some technical difficulties, so welcome Councillor Martin. So if we use the hands up function, and I see there's several hands up. So I've got Mary Horace, if you want to come in first, then Councillor Chohan. So Mary, would you like to?
Yeah, it's just, I noticed on page 17, it says, I can't remember, it's what's this is about. It doesn't actually mention why we're going to go to renewable. So I think we should mention fossil fuels. So it's just a small point of note. And then also the solar panel project. I know that Ealing Transition's been working a lot on implementing panels in schools. So there's an objective for that. So we need to already say we've already done some. And that's my points. Finished there.
So just clarifying some of the text there, so it's a bit clear for people reading, accessing the document.
Yeah.
Fine. And Councillor Chauhan.
Hi, thank you for this report. I mean, I definitely echo everybody's comments up to now about the sort of importance of this work right now. I have a few questions from the report. My first one is on page 47, there's a mention of community energy generation. This it's going to be a bit complicated because it's now referring to the planning which comes later on, but in terms of how the council prioritises what it does with its own assets, I wonder whether this is a new priority that should be included in its 3 sort of tests for whether how community assets are going to be used. So maybe having that as a 4th option. How council spaces can be used for community energy generation is like one question and a suggestion at the same time. Sorry, I've got all these post-it note things in this document I've got to go through. Okay, yeah. My other question is, how are emissions from the construction process offset? So we talk a lot here about zero carbon buildings. Is this, are we also calculating for emissions in construction processes? It's thinking about sort of vehicles visiting sites, how are we calculating that, and then the aftermath of increased vehicles coming to sites when once people move into these new developments. As I know this is about energy, but I'm referring particularly to the mention of delivery of zero carbon buildings that's on page 55 in objective 2. And then my final question is about the solar panel farm. So I was wondering where this particular farm is going to be located and who it's going to benefit. Like, where is this energy going to go? Who will it be serving?
Joe, would you like to come back on a couple of the points there that were raised by Mary and Councillor Chauhan? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So the criteria for asset retention, I think you called it. So I think it would be great if we introduced this as a criteria there. We have been working with the asset, let's see, I think the strategic property team is potentially what their name is, about potentially including some targets in the strategy for that, but for our held assets. But that could be, I think that's a good suggestion. So I've taken note of that, and I'll talk to relevant officers about that. In the construction, correct me if I've interpreted this incorrectly, but so you're asking about the vehicular movement to and from construction sites themselves. Is that what you were considering, like the vehicles or even the generators that are used on site, or the embodied energy of the buildings, like the built environment? Which aspect were you thinking?
I think vehicular movement to and from sites, but also during the construction process. So there are emissions that are related to the very building process, right? In terms of the tools that are used, like we're saying, the consumed emissions that come from the construction process, I suppose. But those are relevant because they'll be, in cases, for instance, with Broadway Living, where we're directly the ones who will be tasked with building sites. That's within our direct remit. So I wonder, is that, I mean, I've seen in planning documents, there's already mention to zero carbon buildings, but I always find that idea very challenging because it almost overrides the fact that the construction process per se means that there will be emissions. And that's why I feel like sometimes there's a bit of jargon that's used that, it would be very helpful to clarify exactly what is done, so we don't just get into this sort of corporate greenwashing, which we as a council, I think, want to or should be aiming to avoid.
Yes. So I agree with that. With the distinction between specifically those two aspects of carbon emissions as they're related to new building or retrofitting of the buildings. So the vehicular traffic, we don't deal with either of those specifically in this strategy. So what we've earmarked for a future chapter, along with the food topic, is that we need to really get our heads around consumed emissions. And so that will absolutely have discussion and we'll review research around the emissions that make up sort of the building blocks, if you will, of construction. So that piece is not dealt with in this particular strategy. The construction vehicles, so in our targets, which we'll probably, when we get to the travel section, you can see what our aspirations are, but we do hope to use our power and influence to move everyone towards lower carbon or zero carbon vehicles. What I understand from our internal services, for instance, our greener Ealing service that deals with our recycling and waste, the trajectory in terms of technology and expense is a little longer for the heavier vehicles. So I can imagine that same theory applies to construction vehicles. There'll be heavier machinery and therefore a little bit more expensive and challenging to decarbonize, but the technology is moving that way. We're seeing some early movers. So we do want to use our buying power to move in that direction. But we haven't been specific around setting targets for that aspect of the strategy. And then your final question was around the solar array, the ground solar array. So this is an aspiration of ours. And we've just started looking at some sites. We've had a community group approach us about a site, and we're looking at feasibility of that and others. And we are fully aware that any time that we're talking about implementing any idea like this, we need to bring the community along with us, because it can't suffer a defeat of lack of information or understanding of the benefits that will bring to the community. So what will be critical to that process will be bringing the community into that discussion to understand why it's essential for local authorities to move in that direction. But happy to hear any more information or more ideas or discussion around that topic of how we might approach that. As an alternative to finding land in borough, our second option would be to look at land outside of our borough, or to look at developments, investing in developments outside of our borough.
Can I just come back quickly to ask the follow-up for that last question was who will that energy then be used by? How do we envisage using the energy produced on the solar panel farm? Or is that part of your answer, saying that it's something that you'd want to establish with participation from the community? Yeah, I think so. From there are a lot of, I'm learning a lot, actually, like live learning about this. There are a lot of technical sides of developing large-scale renewable energy installations, and lots of ways of approaching it where you gain and lose your financial benefits of based on the approach that you take. And so I would say that I think as a priority, if we would probably be creating criteria around sort of when and where it would be appropriate to develop, including sort of biological, ecological impacts, but also how we can provide direct benefits to our residents. I can see that being a top priority for us, but we haven't put that framework together. So I don't want to make promises about that right at this moment, but I think that would need to be co-developed as well as we go through that decision-making process, because it would be a bit backwards to just plaster someplace with solar panels and then sort of export the energy to who knows where. So yeah, so I take your point as to making sure that we get the most benefits in borough out of an installation like that.
There's several discussions and themes about construction and building here. So often the themes talk about low carbon or zero carbon buildings, but the very fact of producing building materials will produce carbon and manufacture steel and concrete, whatever it is. So how is our strategy going to address that? I know we're looking at passive house. So is that about the consumed energy from the building going forward, rather than making sure that all our inputs into that building are as beneficial, as positive as possible? How does that balance out?
So the consumed emissions are largely not a part of the strategy. They are by default. They come into play in some aspects, like for instance, in the waste aspect, there are a lot of consumed emissions that are dealt with in our waste or our waste cycle. But for instance, in the example you mentioned around passive house, that's really about the operational energy. I'm sorry to use jargon, but that means the energy that we use to keep our homes lit and warm, etc. So that standard is mainly about the operational energy. And what we're seeing is that we're at sort of the beginning of a curve of people's awareness and also the industry that can support us in this trajectory towards becoming carbon neutral, both on this operational side, so the energy that we consume on a day-to-day basis. And we're seeing people, business opportunities and designers coming along to this idea of really prioritizing how we think about the embodied emissions of the materials that we use themselves. But I would say we're in a really immature space, not as a local authority necessarily, but as a globe, as a country. And there are some really good examples of that. But it's definitely early movement in that space. There's an organization in London called LETI, L-E-T-I, and they've put together a zero carbon roadmap, which is what we've largely used to base our design guideline around for our new homes in the borough, for our council-owned homes. And I would recommend that could be a nice resource for folks that are interested in this element to explore and see what their roadmap sets out. And that's a group of engineers, architects, designers in that space that are talking about how we feasibly get to that point where we can start addressing not only the design and the operation of buildings, but how they're constructed themselves, and we can really address zero carbon infrastructure.
Thanks for that. I have several people who've not come forward with asking questions. So I've got Councillor Martin, Councillor Sumners and Mary to come forward. So Councillor Martin.
Hello, hi everyone, and sorry I was difficulty getting in. I might have missed a bit of the presentation, but I'm sort of sticking on the same theme really, which is about the construction issues versus the benefits of new builds and carbon efficient buildings. I don't know that we've really able yet to measure that. So as well as the sort of construction, there's demolition, there's often redesign of the natural environment around buildings. And if we're not measuring it, I don't know how we are determining whether or not we're making a negative or positive contribution to decarbonisation. So I think it's a really important point. And I know that in terms of building construction, there's a lot of work being done on this and people understand it very, very well. But in terms of the natural environment and what we do about landscaping around developments, I don't think there is anything like that level of science. And we don't really know if we're pulling out established trees and replacing them with a different type of tree, might not even be as carbon efficient, etc. So I really think, I really welcome what you're saying about how we're going to construct new buildings, but I just worry about the fact that we're not certain about what the overall impact of that is. And we probably need to get clever about measuring that pretty soon. So that's all I wanted to say, but I suspect some of that science isn't even available yet, but maybe someone in the room knows a bit more about that than I do. Thanks.
Thanks, Councillor Martin. If I go to Councillor Summers, then we might take Mary next and have three. Mary, are you okay? Okay, so Councillor Summers, do you want to come in with your questions, contributions? Thank you.
Hello, yeah, thank you. I've got 3 questions at the moment. The first one is about the objective for zero carbon emissions, just mentioned for new buildings. I sit on the planning committee, and I'm not, you know, as I understand it, the planning committee can only reject applications if they do not meet planning law or guidelines. We don't have the right to reject applications just because they're not carbon neutral, as I understand it. But I would be, and I don't think, you know, the Ealing Council does not have the power to change that. It's subject to planning law. But I'd be interested what you have to say about that. Secondly, I think you've been asked about vehicles that the council uses, and I think there was some mention of you know, the technology for larger vehicles not quite being there. I know the council has an aspiration to have electric rubbish and recycling vehicles. We obviously have a new contractor now, but as I believe they're still using diesel vehicles. So do you have any more information on how soon and whether it be financially possible to switch over to electric vehicles for those contractors? And also, and then the last question is a sort of almost a wider question about air quality. For my day job, I was at the inquest earlier this week of a little girl in Lewisham who died of severe respiratory failure. And this is kind of a landmark inquest on air quality. She lived right next to the South Circular Road, and there was a lot of evidence at the inquest about what various politicians and various authorities had been doing or not doing to address the issue, especially of nitrogen dioxide. The mayor's office, successive mayors, not so much the current one, but the 2 before him, were kind of criticised for sort of not doing enough to remove vehicles producing those emissions. And also Lewisham Council were criticised, but I mean, in many regards, it's out of the council's power. You know, if you have the South Circular Road or the North Circular Road running through your borough, and emissions are going to be very high, there's not a great deal as a council you can do. I would be interested to know whether we could do radical things like close down all roads near schools, you know, because in this case, the little girl, she was walking to school, and her school was all surrounded by heavily polluted roads. You know, maybe something's got to be done if we get, because they was also saying that the air quality in London is breaching European levels, and is not expected to come down until 2025 or even later. So in many respects, you know, there's very little that I can see that Ealing Council can do to tackle some of these sort of much wider issues, much bigger issues.
There's quite a few themes in that. I know air quality had a scrutiny panel just not last year, the year before. So a lot of themes were put in there. So I don't know how some that might be slightly out of the scope of climate change. It's part of the ecology and part of the environment. But no, Joe, have you got any things about how all these things might tie together?
So we try to address, I mean, you're absolutely right. We try to address the air quality aspect a bit by bringing forward the co-benefits of addressing climate change. But you're right, the focus of the strategy is not around the particulates related to air quality. obviously what we emit from our vehicles does include carbon emissions, as well as the items you discussed about the NOx and sulfur emissions as well. But that is not actually in the scope of this strategy, aside from being a co-benefit of delivering the strategy.
So I suppose, like our increase, we've had a big increase in electric vehicle charging points, which give us a benefit there. We've had that move nationally towards electric vehicles, which are not, they have a different type of emission, not by a pipe at the back of the car, brakes and tyres, articulates, but there are sort of benefits coming on there. And the points that Councillor Martin also mentioned about how we are assessing or evaluating what we're doing, is there enough data or information there? Is that accessible?
I think that what Councillor Martin was talking about was probably gets into the sphere of what we might call, in planning terms, sorry to be jargonistic about this, but we might call that biodiversity net gain, I think is what the planning term is for that. And so each development would be required by the London plan to demonstrate a net gain in biodiversity for each of the sites. And there's to get even more technical and exclusive probably, there is a factor, a numeric factor that is used to describe whether or not that quality is met. And I was just talking to our planning policy team today about how we may bring some of that into this strategy, or at least our planning section is going to acknowledge that we will be developing a local factor for biodiversity net gain, that we will obviously have the scientific research to back up, so that each of the developments within the borough will need to achieve a certain creation of new habitat, or potentially enhance an adjacent habitat or something, in order to make sure that we continue to have those benefits within the borough. So that could potentially be what the councillor was asking about.
Okay. Councillor Chahan has mentioned about the reason for why air quality wasn't put in with this report. I don't know if you want to just expand on that a little bit.
So this strategy responds directly to the climate emergency, which is entirely about carbon emissions and greenhouse gases, and air quality tends to relate to other chemistry of our air. So it's more probably along the lines of our public health impacts of the air we breathe. We actually have an entire team that's devoted to the regulation of the air quality in our borough, and they have an air quality action plan themselves. And as the chair mentioned, we've done a scrutiny panel on air quality in the past as well. So it's just not a piece that specifically addresses the climate emergency.
So there's ongoing council work already addressing some of this, that will already keep on running through. I just want to highlight, I don't know if anybody else has got any questions on the sort of energy theme. I see Councillor Martin's hand is still up. I don't know if that was just left over, so just say that.
Sorry.
It's okay, it's okay. One thing I was looking at, the performance of existing buildings, which are the majority of our buildings already exist, although there's construction, a lot of them are there. And just when I was looking at the GLA zero carbon proposal, I mean, for a good 10-year period, it's envisaging an average of 100,000 homes being insulated, up to 160,000 in one single year, which is quite phenomenal. That might be spread across London, but how achievable is this? And if these are a lot of private homes, how affordable and accessible is this going to be for individuals if we're going to make it a reality? Because the majority of our homes are privately owned. So how is that going to be ensured that we can actually push that through rather than just council properties, that we can get out there beyond our own estate?
So you're right. It's a monumental task. It's probably going to consume the rest of my professional life, to be honest. A retrofit program. We're fortunate right now in many ways, because the stimulus packages that have been released in the recent months have been very much directed at what's called the green economy. And so that would be all jobs associated with things related to climate emergency and sustainability. So whether that's retrofitting homes or the technology that's required to make buildings and cities smarter, or waste recycling, upcycling types of jobs, nature conservation types of jobs, etc. But the stimulus package has been very much geared towards seeing if this area of the economy will respond. And so we have lots of grant funding. We were just, Ealing was successful in leading a West London bid for about £5 million to help us retrofit our most vulnerable homes. So that's really low energy efficiency and also low income homes. So we've got £5 million, or a share of £5 million to deliver that. And we're about to apply for another £15 million through that program. So that will help us get a jump start on this massive task. As you said, will be, I don't even know if we can get it done in 1 decade. It needs to be a consistent and methodical approach where we support that industry to bring retrofits to both the private and public sector, both commercial and domestic buildings, actually. So I think we need to be consistent. We need to be clear with our residents about the programs that are available. So right now we have, as I said, we have some money to help our vulnerable residents, but we also, there's a green homes voucher program that's available to people who are in privately owned homes. So they're able to apply for, I believe the grant value is £5,000 to help retrofit their homes. The focus of that funding is to what's called decarbonize heating. And so what I mean by that is, instead of a gas-fired boiler, we would be moving to more electric sources of heating. And the reason for that is because the electricity grid in the nation is decarbonizing at a really high rate, excuse me. So that means that we're bringing lots of renewable energy on board to fill the grid with energy, with power. And those are coming from really clean sources of energy. And so electricity is seen as one of the cleaner sources of power right now, one of the cleanest sources of power right now. And so we're going to see a transition to homes moving to electrically heated sources. And so that voucher program is going to help hopefully kickstart us into this retrofit revolution. We also do need to do mass insulating programs, as you said. But it's big work. It's big communications work to make sure that people have the right information, are getting the right labor force to do quality work for them, or knowing how to operate these new systems that might be slightly different from what we're used to. So it's a big piece of work that our teams are going to have to pursue.
Thanks. Councillor Chohan, I see you've got your hand up indicated there. Do you have a question to come in?
Sorry, I was just sorry to keep asking so many questions. Or rather, it might be a suggestion in terms of like trying to help the borough, and particularly the private housing sort of section of the borough, to moving towards greener electricity sources. It might be useful to have bigger windows, because I understand, like, this year alone, I think there's been a scheme or 2 schemes where we've tried to get residents to do collective bids for cheaper energy, greener energy. And And I think having bigger windows or having those schemes open more frequently might be useful in terms of encouraging, because sometimes it comes in a window, it's like a month or 2 months that you've got, and then, you know, sometimes it has happened to me that it slips my mind. So, I mean, from personal experience, I know that it would be really useful to be able to have, you know, an option at various points in the year for people.
Yeah, I think that's a good example of the council as facilitator so that enabling capacity of the council. Joe, do you have any? I mean, I think this will be the end of like the energy section. Any sort of any themes or comments that come out from all of this?
No, I'm hoping that I've helped address some of the queries that have come through. They're very, I appreciate the engagement in this topic. It's one of the biggest aspects. It's not one that many people are interested in on a personal level, to be honest. Energy always sort of comes in last place on interest levels, but it's such a big piece of the puzzle that we really do need to sort of encourage people to be interested in this critical element of addressing climate change. So yeah, that's all I've got.
Thank you. So the next section was on like nature. So Joe, I don't know if you want to just kick us off with a couple of points about where that fits into the strategy, then we can come back with some reflections and comments.
Yeah, so I'm just sharing my screen right now on the 3 objectives that we've outlined around nature. So our first is around our tree canopy. So our objective is to increase our tree canopy cover, and the target that we've adopted, I'm not going to go into targets in too much detail, but the target that we've adopted is the one that was really assigned to us through a scientific study that but was done by GLA, and they've assigned targets for each of the boroughs. So our aspiration is to meet the target of, I believe it's 35% canopy cover. So that means sort of the crown and leaf of the trees to be covering 35% of the borough by 2030. The second objective is around really the management of our green spaces. So you can think of that in 2 parts. One is literally the operational aspect. So how we power machinery to take care of our green spaces, but also the methods, the conservation methods that we use as a service to increase biodiversity and what's considered natural carbon capture. So things like retaining meadows and, for instance, planting hedgerows, obviously the canopy cover, and really trying to maximize the benefits that we can produce in borough in the limited sort of urban space that we have to do so. And the last objective is around green infrastructure. So this gets into a little bit around sort of wetlands and ponds and those type of elements. And those are really thought to help us with the increasing intensity and frequency of urban flood events. So we're looking at utilizing our green infrastructure to both mitigate that flooding and also bring forward the benefits of biodiversity, water quality, and carbon capture. So those are the 3 main focuses of this aspect of the strategy.
Thanks, Joe. Do I have, if there's comments about this aspect or any questions, please? Yeah, so I've got Councillor Martin's hand there that I can see.
Thank you. Just going back really to what I was talking about previously. Yeah, I was talking about biodiversity net gain and things like that, but also about carbon capture and how we know, or if we as yet can measure, what is the most efficient in terms of carbon capture. So old trees versus new trees, for example, different types of trees, I believe, do have greater capacity to capture carbon. When we're designing some of these things, have we got that in mind? Is the science there yet that can support us in making the right decisions in terms of how we green our spaces and how we get the most out of that from a carbon capture point of view? That's me. Thanks.
Councillor Chauhan, do you want to come in as well now with your question, because I saw your hand came up as well? Thank you.
Yeah, I guess I've got, again, quite a few comments to this section. One is to sort of pick up on a point that Councillor Martin made previously, and I think she was building on here again. Sort of to add another angle to that, to say that there should be sort of less siloed working across the council, because I know there are various sites that are sold for development, or that the council sort of gives planning permission for, that might be on private land, not on only on public land, that once sold, like swathes of trees are just sort of cut down in the process. So I wonder whether something can be built into planning process to stipulate, okay, well, if we give planning permission, there has to be some level of conservation of these trees. And this happened in a site in my ward just this year gone. So that's one thing about thinking about carbon capture and how going ahead our the permission that we give to planning might undermine that achievement or the goal. A few other questions I have are, what about our like sort of considering signing up to no pesticide and no herbicide use in our green spaces and parks, and sort of encouraging that as an influencing role in the public gardens as well. That could be, I think that's quite an important part of the ecological disaster, is the impact that a lot of these chemical inputs have. And I know that this is like a nationwide campaign. I think it would be really sort of timely to think about joining up to that and how we integrate that within our objectives. And some sort of clarification questions are, where does our green waste from our parks currently go? Because it's saying here that in Objective 2 that we don't want that to leave the borough by 2030. And again, for Objective 3, there's a term called green infrastructure. All residential and commercial new builds and refurbishments to include green infrastructure. So if you could just clarify what those terms mean. And one final proposal would be something that may seem a bit like a small issue, but I know that it's quite expensive to donate trees right now to parks, to our local parks. If we wanted to donate a tree, we actually, as members of the public, have to fork out quite a lot. So I wonder if there's something to look into that. It might be a good way of encouraging the public to help with our increase of our canopy. Looking at the cost around that as well.
Joe, do you want to come back with any sort of comments with those? Yeah.
So for Councillor Martin, I would say in terms of the science, I wish I was more fluent about the science. I know that our parks team is very savvy, and they are definitely following the science and very interested in making sure that they're using science to lead their conservation efforts. And I also know that science is always evolving, and the knowledge that we're getting from that and the local applications of what tree is best where and what age, we're always learning. And so I know that we have a very good and agile team of parks officers that are working with that knowledge to make decisions about the management of parks. So I know that the Biodiversity Action Plan is going to be published in 2021. So we're tying up really closely to those actions, because there's so much good conservation work that's being done there and committed to in that action plan. So a lot of that is a lot of the science that's in that strategy document, or in that planning document. In relation to the second question, which I think was Councillor Chauhan, the second series of questions. So just to say that maybe the biodiversity, the net gain commitments could help us there. I think there's a big challenge that we have as an organization. One, we have a lot of great policies on the books, but there's a question around how we monitor whether or not those are being fulfilled. And that's a question around resourcing, and maybe a question around priority as well. So I think that would be a great question to keep prodding at and seeing if we can give more effort towards the monitoring of making sure that those planning conditions are fulfilled. In relation to the pesticide and herbicide use query, we've put an action in the action plan that I don't think appears in the version of the strategy that you've seen, but I've talked to both our street services and our parks team about whether or not we can make that a strong target commitment for this plan. So we've put an action in to develop our strategy to minimize the use of herbicides and pesticides, but that is going to have to be carefully balanced with the economic impacts of making that change. So again, I would say just stay on that topic and stay on the relevant services for advocating for that if you want to see that appearing in a stronger way. The green waste currently, as I understand it, this is not my service, but as I understand it, for instance, our tree services, when they take down a tree, part of the contract is that they are able to take the resource that's created by taking down a tree, and that is part of the contract, is that they can then utilize that resource for whatever markets that they find. And so that's part of why we've included it in this strategy, is so that we can retain that resource, because there's such great value, not necessarily financial value, but ecological value to reusing all that material in Borough. Let's see, I'm not familiar at all with the cost of donating a tree. And you asked about the use of the language green infrastructure. Green infrastructure is, so if you've seen any of the installations we've done on the highway schemes, which are like the plantings that deal with stormwater or flood events. So that's what we're talking about, using nature to sort of provide us some of the essential services that we might have previously put into the sewer system, or for instance, like a green roof is considered green infrastructure. So it's ways of dealing with the rainwater specifically to sort of mitigate the effects of flooding, or to help us not feel those effects. So I think that's.
Thanks, Joe. I've got Councillor Mohan with his hand up, and unless anybody else wants to come in on this section, then we'll move on after Councillor Mohan's. I mean, just to add on to Joe's comments there, and also to help with some feedback for Councillor Sumners, I know the Greener Ealing provision for vehicles, the smaller vehicles which are used in parks, a lot of them are electric vehicles. So where we could, we did move towards electric vehicles there. Trees for Cities has worked an awful lot in Ealing, and is a charity that has invested an awful lot in delivering trees. So if people wanted to contribute for Trees for Cities, that would be one option, because they've literally delivered thousands of trees in Ealing. And I know the Greener Ealing contract in terms of herbicides and pesticides had some specific exclusions, not to use certain chemicals. Forgive me if I can't remember exactly the specification, but there was consideration in the Greener Ealing contract to exclude certain types of chemicals because of their greater impact. Just to add that to sort of the background there as well. So Councillor Mohan, and then I've got Councillor Martin's hand up again, and then after that, we'll move on to the next section. Thank you. So Councillor Mohan.
Thank you, Chair. It's a kind of suggestion. I'm glad that Ealing has planted very many trees in the last few years. That's a very good development. And what I want to say is that in terms of planting trees in private land, for example, people's rear gardens or front gardens, I don't see if there is any initiative. I think if we can encourage people who are willing to sort of plant trees in their own private or personal gardens, that will be really good. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Mohan. Thank you. And Councillor Martin.
Thank you. Yeah, just a quick point about green roofs, which are also in the list under nature. Firstly, just to clarify if we have improved the specification for them, because I know a lot of green roofs tend to die quite quickly because they're insufficient depth of soil, for example, can be an issue. But also whether or not we'd consider looking at moss walls, which is another thing we could ask developers to do, and I believe is probably more efficient, or maybe more efficient than a green roof. So just that point. Thanks.
Councillor Martin, what was the last point? Moss walls. Oh, you just muted.
Sorry. Yes, moss walls, which are supposedly incredibly efficient in carbon capture. So I'm told by the salespeople anyway.
Okay. I've not heard of that phrase before, word, so okay. I'm unsure. So Joe, I don't know if you want to, if there's any points that can come in here, and then we'll move on to transport, just so I'm conscious of time as well.
Okay, I don't have any further comments about that.
Right, okay, so private planting of trees and gardens, I'm not sure what the requirements are, but or how they could be assisted. The swalls, I've not heard of that, but I think that might be something to go with planning in terms of specifications, that they meet certain criteria. I don't know what the criteria is, but I think that should be taken with planning, I think, perhaps. Joe, can you go on to transport? And I know Peter was going to come on as well. So if Joe, if you've got sort of to kick off, and then Peter's going to come in then as well.
I do. Are you seeing my screen now, the travel objective?
Yes.
Great. So our three objectives here are to reduce the number of vehicles in the borough, to increase active travel, and then to decrease the carbon consumption of motor vehicles. So we're trying to reduce the number of vehicles in the borough, which creates a safer environment for both cycling, scootering, walking. And then for all of the required vehicles that are left in the borough, we're looking at really reducing the carbon emissions of the ones that are absolutely essential to be there.
Right. Thanks. So that's our objectives there. So Peter, would you like to come in, because you've got some points? Just while we're doing that, I just thought, obviously we've got low traffic neighbourhoods as a very big theme in the borough. Just so to let the panel know, and also anybody viewing this, is that there is a substantial discussion of that scheduled at the overview and scrutiny meeting, which is happening this week, and there's the interim review going to Cabinet next week. So we're not discounting that as an issue, but as long as people realise there is two forthcoming meetings, both we've got substantial discussions of that fact happening. So Peter, can I hand over to you to give your input? Thank you.
Okay, right, just a brief introduction to myself. I've been a transport planner for more than 50 years, which is about the same length of time as I've lived in Ealing, covering all modes of transport. I've designed motorways, railways, but for the last 25 years, I've had a strong interest in cycling, mainly for environmental reasons. Behind me, you can see a map of Europe. All these lines on that map, I've cycled with my wife on a tandem. Otherwise, she's in a wheelchair. So I understand what is possible in Europe. Now, I'm going to just put some slides up on the screen a moment. Here we are. Right. Is that coming up?
Not at the moment.
No, right. I probably need to go back and do a share screen. There we are. There we are. Right. Let's try that. Share. Is that coming now?
Yes, we can see that. Yep.
Excellent. Right. Now, if I go to view, we can get that hopefully in full screen mode. Right. Yeah. So I think I just want to make the point that transport sustainability and congestion reduction are quite separate things. They're linked. And at the moment in the carbon powered world, we have traffic jams which waste lots of fuel, and it's unsustainable and polluting. and public transport can help that. But in a future world where we're all driving electric vehicles, vehicles stuck in traffic jams won't be using fuel or polluting. But electricity is still going to be a very precious commodity because we'll be using it to heat homes and other things. And it could be decades before it all comes from renewable sources. So minimizing energy use per passenger kilometre is going to become key. And here are some CO2 emission figures up at the top on this it's a very generalized graph, but it gives you an idea of the relative efficiencies of different modes of transport in typical occupancies. And you can see that aeroplanes don't look too good on that. Buses don't look too good either. Coaches are quite good because they tend to be point-to-point fully loaded. It depends very much on the occupancy of each vehicle, how vehicles compare. But rail is better. And Eurostar looks very good because it's all nuclear fuel, but that has its own problems. But when I was working full time, I used to reckon as a rule of thumb, any bus service that needed a subsidy was probably going to turn out to be less sustainable in CO2 terms than car travel. And out of London, a lot of the bus services are in fact heavily subsidised. Something like the 207 up the Uxbridge Road will be okay, but some of these ones that go out into the leafy suburbs of Ealing won't be so good. But down at the bottom of this page, you can see how a bicycle compares, and it is just head and shoulders. I mean, it's a whole order of magnitude more sustainable. So if we now look at the future electrical world, I've put down here some energy consumption per kilometre of typical electric vehicles that are the best on the market at the moment. And you can see that actually electric buses are no better than electric cars, whereas electric bikes, which are even better than conventional bikes, are a whole order of magnitude more sustainable than either buses or cars. And pedelecs are a really important innovation in the last decade. The tandem that I ride is a pedelec. That's 2.6 units per passenger kilometre, compared with about 80 on an electric bus. But what's the conclusions for that for the climate strategy? The first thing is the emphasis on active travel. That's good. But I think that there isn't enough recognition of the difference between cycling and public transport. So they should never be linked together. And to suggest that at least 80% of Ealing Council staff should be travelling sustainably to work by active travel or public transport, that's not right. Active travel is sustainable, public transport, not really. Why are people not cycling at the moment? And the reason is that by far the biggest response from Ealing Cycling Campaign members or potential members is that it's perceived as being too dangerous. That's not to say it is too dangerous. It's actually even more dangerous is not cycling because of all the other health benefits you get from cycling. But what is really lacking in Ealing is a defined cycle network, so that somebody who's thinking of taking up cycling can go a few hundred metres to their nearest point on the borough cycle network, where they know they will then have a continuous network with joined up routes. Where we've got LTNs, if they create some low traffic streets, that's great, but unless they're joined up to the next LTN, that's not part of a network. And the sort of level of provision that we're looking for is something like the Boston Manor Road cycle path, and that set a really good standard. Just to put it in international context, in the bits of Holland of the same population density per square kilometre, about 10 cycle journeys there are to every 1 bus journey. In Ealing, it's 10 bus journeys to every cycle journey. That's a difference of 100 as a ratio. There's an awful lot of local journeys in Ealing, which if they're not done by car, it'll be much easier to get people onto bikes than it should be to get them into buses. So what you need to be doing is to really get back on track with the borough cycle plan that you produced last year. I think there's been a lot of deflection of officer input into the LTNs, which has actually taken the eye off the ball. Now, final thing is one of the policies in the emergency strategy is workplace parking charging. I think that's a red herring. It's nothing to do with sustainability, that it's a revenue raising device. I think you could find a lot of professional effort gets diverted into that if you pursue that. I would suggest you strike it out of the sustainability policy and deal with it in some other way if you want to pursue it. And the final slide I've got is various ways of dealing with congestion. This is a paper that I produced for the Royal Town Planning Institute just at the end of my full-time working career. And you'll see that right at the most promising way forward is electronic road pricing. And I think if Ealing want to be trailblazing, you should be looking at ways in which you can have the equivalent of road pricing within Ealing. How you do it, various ways you could look at, but that's the way that you should be trailblazing. And you could use that to control how or influence how people travel. Thank you. That's what I've got to say there.
Thank you, Peter. You've raised some definite points there. I think Rishi Sunak might have beaten you to it in terms of getting out public charging for road usage or distance in some way, because he was in the news about that not so long ago. I don't know I don't know what scope we have as a council for doing that. So Peter's raised several points there about some of the aims and strategies. I can see Councillor Martin has got a hand up, and Councillor Chohan as well. Thank you. Councillor Martin, do you want to come in? Thank you.
Thank you. It's more comments than questions, really. So in the you did a chart where you compared emissions from different vehicles, Peter. I was just interested in the car one. You used 4 passengers. I'm just wondering what the difference would have been if you use 1, because there are quite a lot of people that drive alone.
Are you talking about it is the second page?
Yeah, I think
if there's 1 passenger, you'll see that's the second line, third line down.
Okay. Sorry, I missed that.
Yeah, so it's really dependent on the occupancy, and the same with buses. A bus with 4 people in, it's actually more energy efficient to put them in a large car.
Yeah. Okay. And your second one, which was comparing electric vehicles. I don't drive, so I wasn't quite sure what all of those were. Are some of those cars?
Coming down the list from the top, the first 2 are the most commonly available battery city buses that are currently in production.
Okay.
The next one down is the Tesla, which is actually, it's quite a big vehicle, but it happens to be very energy efficient as electric cars go.
Okay.
So that's why that's up there on the list. I've put in a smart for 2, and the reason for that is that smarts, the small ones, are much less congesting at traffic lights and on the road system. They actually use up less road space. So in an hour, you can get probably 50% more through a set of traffic lights than you could conventionally sized cars. Did quite a lot of research into that at one point. The next one is a Super Soco TC Max motorbike. That is a effectively what that is. All around Ealing, we have little small motorbikes whizzing around delivering pizzas and things with L plates on. If you use the electric equivalent, and there are tens of millions of these in China, probably hundreds of millions in China actually, they are motorbikes. They're not pedelecs where you have to push the pedals to make the thing work. And they are actually surprisingly energy inefficient because although they're half the consumption of a car with two people in, they're still not that good. The Pinot Tandem Pedelec, that is a two-seater bicycle that's got a pedelec attachment so that if you turn on the power, when you push on the pedals, it multiplies your effort. And that's something I've ridden for the last 5 years. We've ridden it all over Europe now. We've ridden it to Budapest. And that, you can see 2.6, it is incredibly efficient. The battery holds the same energy as 2.5 chocolate chip cookies. And that will take you for about 40 kilometers.
Wow.
The final one is the Carrera Crossroad, which is the most energy efficient and affordable one you can buy from the Halfords website. So that's just sort of what you go down if you just go, I want an electric pedelec, and that's what you'd get from Halfords at the moment.
Right.
So that's what those various vehicles are.
Thank you very much, Peter.
No, that's at all.
Thank you. I will never look at chocolate chip cookies quite the same again. Councillor Chauhan, was your hand up as well there?
Yeah, I just have a quick question. I wonder, could you tell me where hybrid vehicles would kind of go in your list of in terms of energy use? So those are the ones that are half petrol, half battery.
Yeah, I'm afraid not very good. I looked very carefully at buying a hybrid vehicle, the last car but one, and actually I found that from a carbon point of view, a diesel car was more efficient, and a small diesel was more efficient than going out and buying a Prius. Certainly, the small diesel generates more particulates, which asphyxiate one's neighbours. So I tried not to drive it round in Ealing very much. But from a CO2 point of view, the hybrids don't perform nearly as well as a pure electric car. The plug-in hybrids are a bit better. The trouble with all electric vehicles, the batteries are incredibly heavy. So if you have a battery bus, the problems you're getting on Eaton Rise and so on with the buses destroying the carriageway and vibrating the houses will become even worse because the battery buses are so heavy. And the same thing applies for electric cars. And then there's the further problem is what you do with the battery when it's spent. Because at the moment that recycling the battery is going to be 5 times as expensive as mining new lithium out of a lithium mine. So people won't recycle them. And we will have a similar problem to the problem that we've got with plastic bags, is that people don't recycle plastic bags because it's cheaper to just make new ones. And I think that this is a time bomb which still needs exploring. It's not something Ealing can deal with, but it's something you need to be thinking about, what's going to happen to all these discarded batteries when they stop being chargeable and you have to replace them.
Thank you, Peter. I've got Councillor Mohan who's indicating now. Thank you.
Oh, hi, Peter. On a light note, you haven't listed walking anywhere in your presentation.
I have actually. If you look on the second page, below the list of the different modes, not below the blue diagram, there's an amber diagram. down on the page 2 of the present.
Okay.
You see, where there's a yellow box saying by comparison, cycling's a clear winner.
Okay.
Yeah. Now on the left there, you can see how much energy, and even on a bicycle, it's the faster you pedal, the more wind resistance there is. And when you get up to 15 miles an hour, which is incidentally, that's the fastest that a pedelec will give you any assistance, because at more than 15 miles an hour, the electricity cuts out completely. But if you're 25-year-old and fit, 15 miles an hour is no problem. But walking uses more than twice as much energy as even pedaling at 15 miles an hour.
Right. Okay, thank you. Thanks.
Sorry.
Thank you.
So Chair Peter, we know that we are seeing every day, more and more these electric scooters, and it's definitely energy efficient. But we are not thinking about the safety point of view. That's very, very dangerous. Like, they're like, it's really very dangerous if somebody had an accident and they might, how they survive. So we're looking at that point of view.
Right. Well, the countries where electric scooters have really taken off are very often the ones where they have a very good cycling infrastructure. So if you imagine, I don't know if you're familiar with Boston Manor Road, with the new cycleway that Hounslow put in there. If you have an electric scooter on that, it's actually not very dangerous. It's only when you have electric scooters in an area of the borough where there is no cycling infrastructure, the road is very crowded, so they're tempted to go on the footway. And the footway isn't designed for electric scooters or bicycles. But unless you make the road itself safe to bicycle on, it won't really be safe for electric scooters either.
I'm just worrying about, to imagine the scooter going in the pothole.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
then what's going to happen, the head-on knock, or two scooters colliding with each other?
Yeah, I think it will be a problem. I think a scooter is inherently a more dangerous form of transport than a bicycle, because it has a very small wheel.
Thank you, Councillor Ahmed. Thank you. Can I just look at one of the points in the report, which talks about the workplace parking levy? I know Hounslow have, if they haven't introduced it, have proposed it in Brentford area, with the reasoning that any money raised will then contribute to develop of a station and public transport. Playing devil's advocate about this, if you're a business, you're thinking, well, this is another cost. We can understand the merit for encouraging fewer people to drive to work, more people to come by other means. I also know that we're going to probably have a very sharp economic shock. And I'm thinking of all the tensions that are there. I don't know if Joe's got any thoughts also about how this plays in with opinions from business, how that might reflect on them. I know it would be another cost, or how any understanding of how this has been played out in Hounslow as well, because obviously it's our near neighbour, and it'd be good to understand some of the learning from what's happened there.
Yeah. I think just before this particular line of discussion goes any further, I must declare an interest, which is that I do advise GlaxoSmithKline on strategic transport issues. In fact, I've managed to, we've got several hundred people cycling to work at GSK House. And I think if you look at employers in Brentford and look at the postcodes of where their staff live, you'll find that very few journeys would actually transfer to the new railway that is proposed to be funded by the transport parking levy. And I think that's why employers feel really aggrieved by it in Brentford, because it isn't actually going to address their problems. In Nottingham, where the workplace parking levy has been a successful thing, the employers could see that it was actually going to fund a tram system which was actually going to help most of their employees. That isn't the case in the Hounslow one, and I think it's going to become a sink for professional effort, and it'll be good for the legal profession. And I think it's basically we should be trying to dissuade people from travelling on the roads in vehicles rather than charging them for parking. It's a very blunt instrument, the workplace parking levy, and that's why it's been so rarely used. In fact, I'm not sure it's been used at all outside Nottingham.
Right. I mean, that may be something that Ealing needs to take on board, is how those funds would be used and understanding the needs of the workforce of those companies and how all this is going to marry together. So maybe something Ealing can take on board. I know I'm conscious of time, so Peter, thank you for all your information on coming back with that there. With all the points there. I don't know if Joe has got any points to bring any themes of this together, and then we've got waste to consider and then go on to engagement. And Peter, have you got any final points there as well, just before we move on?
Well, just one final point to mention is that Westrans were beginning to get quite interested in a node-based cycle network for West London. It was going to be considered at their next meeting. This is back in March this year, and of course that all got shelved. I would commend you to get Westrans back on track for that, because they got really interested in that. That's my final point.
Right, thank you. Right. I've just got a note here from Councillor Chauhan. I'm just very conscious of time. Thank you, Peter. There, Councillor Chauhan's put in a note in the comment. Councillor Chauhan, do you want to come in with your comments, and then we'll take Joe and move on to waste then? Is that okay? Thank you.
Yeah, sorry. When I earlier put up my hand, I thought we were going to return to the report afterwards, which is why I didn't mention it then. Okay. I have some quick points in regards to some of the objectives in the report. I wonder what more we could be doing in terms of like the vehicle scrappage scheme. So I understand that the Mayor of London's scheme currently to help the scrappage of diesel vehicles only applies to certain demographic according to sort of socioeconomic status. So I wonder if the council can go, that's one of Joe's original questions, how we could possibly go further, if there's ways that we could broaden that scheme and just make it sort of wholesale support that we had to incentivize scrappage of diesel cars. And also in relation to reducing parking provision in new developments, this is something that we've already found in my ward in South or Broadway, and I've brought this up before, that residents are still, who are moving into these sites, are still using CPZs after CPZ hours expire or finish for the day. So I think there's some, I don't think this is going far enough if we're trying to encourage fewer cars with new developments, and potentially more thinking needs to be done about making CPZs 24 hours or talking with residents about that as a possible option to really enforce the no car policy for new builds. And the final comment I had was about local surcharges on old diesel cars. I just wonder how that would be enforced if one wasn't living in a CPZ area. So those were just some comments. Yeah, I understand we're running out of time.
Great. Thanks, Councillor Chowan. So Joe, if you've got any thoughts that summarise some of the comments, then we'll go into waste. So if Joe, if you've got anything to come back there, then we can move on. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Thanks so much, Peter, for your contributions, as always. Lots of great food for thought. I'm afraid I'm not an expert in transport policy, maybe luckily at this stage. So I can't really comment on, for instance, the work the workplace parking levy and those ideas. But I know that what we're aiming to do is sort of knock on all of the doors that are available to us, and to test policies that have had success in other areas to see if they are locally applicable. So I think at this stage, we're just looking at making sure that we research what could possibly work for Ealing and not sort of rule anything out at these sort of initial stages of the launch of the strategy, and be innovative. And with regard to the CPZ or the comments that were around the parking aspects, I'm also not a parking expert, but I do recall a conversation with our parking colleagues to say that one of the aspects that they have, I believe it's either about to be introduced or has been approved to be introduced, is that even with your pay to park meters, that is now going to be linked up to the type of car that you're driving and the fuel associated with that. And so there's going to be an air quality carbon emissions aspect to that pricing as well.
Yeah.
So great. Would you like me to share the slides on waste as our last formal section here? Great. So we've got the 3 objectives around waste are, it's really so I start this section to say that Ealing is awesome at recycling. So we're the 2nd best borough in London for recycling. We have a tremendous record for participating in recycling, and we can always do more, of course, and we want to do more, but we want to applaud that effort. But we also are now about to pivot towards waste reduction in a very big way to address the climate emergency. And so this section is really about bringing the attention of the people to the fact that we just have too much stuff. So our first objective of this strategy is to reduce our overall waste in the borough, waste produced in the borough. Our second objective is to maximize the use of the materials that we do have. And this is where Mary's work on the Repair Cafe comes in. And we're hoping to see lots more local initiatives sprout up around this idea of creating an entire economy around repairing and reusing and giving another life to items. And the third objective is, again, picking up the operational elements. So because we've got Greener Ealing on board now, our recycling and waste company that is now in the control of the council, we have a lot more influence in this area to ask them to really bring performance efficiencies here, which will save them money and also bring us carbon emissions reductions from this aspect of services that we provide. So those are our 3 areas of main concern in this in the waste theme. And you can see on the left-hand side of your screen, that's just a very typical waste hierarchy where you're starting with refusing things in the first place, redesigning things. So getting into that part of where waste is created. It's actually at the conception or the creation of objects or of food packaging, for instance, all the way down to reducing, reusing, recycling, and then finally either incineration or landfill. So moving to a more circular view of the waste hierarchy.
Right. Thanks, Joe. So I don't know if we've got any comments here. I know Ealing has for a long time done really well in terms of London boroughs in terms of recycling, which has been great, and we've still kept that place, and the recycling rates are still increasing, and we're sort of probably regularly over 50% or mid-50s. I mean, just as an aside in terms of like not using as much waste, I mean, I think the street WhatsApp group has sort of burgeoned over COVID. And I know my WhatsApp group in my street is now recycling various household items at a rapid rate rather than just going to be the black bin. I'm the beneficiary of a nice rug. Other people have got all sorts of equipment. And it's just kind of from something that wouldn't have been there to getting something else, how we can get those types of very small scale social contacts and how they can be used, which is great to be seen how that can be done. And the other point I had, which is almost escaping me. Anyway, it was just that kind of, it was like almost a beneficial outcome of COVID, how that connections have been used and worked. So which has been great to see. And the idea of like, I think Mary's got this idea, I don't know if Mary wants to come in terms of how we're not repairing and ensuring people's items have got a longer life than they had before. Because Mary, you're to a library of things of sorts. So is that
we wanted to set up like a repair cafe.
Yeah.
We looked into electrical items, but there's a lot of liability. So our repair cafe looks at textile and fabrics and clothes and trying to encourage people to mend them. So, but the other thing is I think we also need to get a mind set moved. It's not like you've just said, waste isn't waste, it's just not used. You know, it's if to someone else it might feel as waste, but it still might be used somewhere else. This is, we've got to think about circular economy, and I had a problem with calling it waste. I'd rather it be called sort of resource management.
Mm-hmm. Yes, yeah, there's still investments in that.
Yeah. I mean, you know, it seems plastic isn't a waste, it can be recycled. It's either that we haven't got the capability. So, you know, let's choose plastics that can be recycled. Let's choose materials that can be recycled.
Right, thanks. I mean, the other point that came to mind in terms of waste was we have a significant food production industry in Ealing. Literally the number of sandwiches produced in Ealing goes into the hundreds and hundreds of thousands, but we have health inspectors that go around, so, and I'm sure they've got a job to do doing the health inspections, but maybe they've also got a role to make connections and give information and be a point of contact with the food industry in terms of packaging and processing and how resource efficient or the products of their use can actually be made more sustainable. So looking at about how the services the council delivers can be used in other ways as well, to be a role of influencer as well. So I wonder how that can be used as well. That was kind of came along there. I'm very, very close to, like, I don't want to run out of time, but I can't see any more indicators for hands. Oh, I've got sorry, I spoke too soon. I've got Councillor Martin here. And that is Councillor Ahmed, was that?
Yeah, I just quickly, I wanted to, you know, the repair cafe, that point of view. I mean, what can we do to encourage to repair the electric stuff like household, small things like, for example, we have a kettle, like an electric kettle. Sometimes, you know, just need a little fuse to be changed, and electric can be repaired again, and it's lifelong rather than throwing away and buying a new one. So I think, what can we do to encourage people if they can be recycle it, like, you know, so we are to reduce that. Small items like, you know, and electric, you know, stuff, these things. What can we do to encourage people and make it interesting for that? That's just point.
I'm going to ask Mary to just respond, because that's Mary.
The repair cafe, there is a network of repair cafes. It's all to do with liability. So we could and cost. So you can join the repair network, but that costs money. And then we'll have their liability. And how you do it is you teach the person how to fix it. So rather than us fixing it, the person will be taught how to fix it. So then it's their liability and not our liability.
That's a definite upskilling that's being there. Okay. Fine. And Councillor Martin, you've got your hand up there. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, I was just a comment really about raising awareness, because I think people are often very confused about what is recyclable and what isn't recyclable. So maybe we could do a bit more on that front. And just a comment for myself. I mean, I put out some textile recycling, which didn't get collected, and it sat there for weeks, and I think eventually it did get taken, but I'm not even sure if it was taken by the council or somebody else. And so that was particularly confusing. I think I did check the website, but so just making things clearer, even if it's on the website, when people have to go and find out how they do something, I think would also help to improve that. And our rates are good, but I think it would help to improve it a bit more as well.
Yeah. For those who can't see, Peter is exhibiting a how to recycle leaflet produced by, I'm not sure who's the production by, but I can see a whole, I think it's different types of plastic that how whether they can or cannot be recycled.
It's getting people to read them though, isn't it?
Yeah.
I showed that just to show how complicated it is.
Yes, yeah, and understanding what plastics can and cannot be and all this, yeah. The last part of this was more about how we engage and get people involved, which is crucial to moving this further forward. I know Ealing Transition have done a lot of work with this, and Mary was involved with the input on the policy as well as were Ealing Transition. But Joe, do you have any points to come back on the discussion and then moving forward onto the engagement?
I do. I just had to find my unmute.
Yeah.
Sorry. So I mean, waste is just to summarize on that waste point. I mean, it's a really exciting space to be working in, and I feel like there is just a unending aspect of community involvement that we could do with this specific topic. Like I think people are really excited. There's also a lot of economic benefits to it. There's a huge amount of job growth that we could bring forward from this particular theme. And it's just an exciting space for us to work in. So, and again, just moving the conversation, it just on from the recycling. Like, we are very good at recycling. We need to continue that work. We need to continue to make it simpler, but really getting to that waste minimization messaging is going to be what's the utmost important in terms of addressing climate change through our waste behaviors. So is it okay to move on to the engagement side of things? Great. So I hate to leave this to last, because this is kind of one of the most crucial, I don't know if I can say most crucial of anything, that they all feel very crucial, but as I started with at the beginning of this presentation, if we think that maybe 90% of carbon emissions are going to come from the community outside of council direct impact, communications are going to be so essential to this journey. So we are just getting started here. And I hope that a lot of you have read the Around Ealing magazine over the last, well, years, but in recent months, sort of the last, let's say 24 months, the editing team there has really captured some great stories around all of the excellent work that's happening in the borough and sort of the foundational stuff. And so we're going to continue to pursue that relationship to make sure those stories get highlighted so that we have that broad appeal to our residents. But we've also gone out to them on a more direct level, where we've gone and surveyed them earlier this summer when we were about to go out to our we wanted to start engaging with people on this strategy, but because of the pandemic, we weren't sure if it was the right timing. So we went out for a little bit of a survey to our online residents panel to kind of see where their interests were and to take the temperature of whether or not they're ready to talk about climate change. And they were overwhelmingly ready to talk about climate change. I think we were all ready to talk about anything else by that point, to be honest. But I just thought I'd share this slide with the responses that we had. I think we had about, don't quote me on this, I know it's being recorded, but I think we had 1,000 responses to this survey. And so we had what people are highly interested in, won't be surprising probably to this audience, but parks and green spaces is just like at the top of the list for people, followed closely by green transport and then waste reduction. And what's close to my heart is energy efficiency, which is all the way to the left, coming in last place, but we're going to do something about that. So that's just to give you an indication of sort of what our residents are interested in. So we're hitting I think we're hitting some good interest areas in this strategy. I also wanted to just do a quick one on the citizen review panel, which the expert witnesses here tonight were all a part of, and really appreciate the views of these residents. So we ended up having 12 residents that we invited to participate and give a really deep and critical review, independent review of our strategy. We had a great facilitation team that was in to help us out with this process. In fact, they ran the process for us to keep it independent from the council. And week by week, we just went through and worked through each of the themes, pulled it apart, and they gave us a really great feedback report, which is available on our website now, about sort of how the strategy worked for the audience and didn't work for the audience. And so we then took all of that feedback back to our officer groups and made improvements. A really great approach to pretty like small scale, intense engagement, but very, very valuable information coming out of that, and really helped shape the final strategy. And then we went on, from there we went on to a broader public consultation. So I just wanted to let all of the counselors on the call know that we had about 518 responses to the consultation. So a wonderful response. And again, showing that there's a huge, like enormously powerful interest in climate action in the borough. And we had great response from a number of organizations as well that coordinated some responses and gave us really great feedback. Again, went through a similar process of taking their views and taking them back to officers and seeing where we could make that more reflective in the strategy and more what the residents wanted to see. The big takeaways from that is that they wanted us to be more ambitious, to give them more data, and just to be clearer with how we were conveying our message. And finally, this third piece here is about an upcoming concept, really, that's just coming together. And actually, Mary and Trevor are instrumental in bringing this along as well. So we've got it's conceptual, but we've got an online community that we're trying to bring together for climate action across the borough. And the intention here is to really highlight that climate action, so taking action on climate change, is really a part of almost every aspect of our lives, because it's an equalities issue. As we've seen here, the major themes that we've touched on, waste and travel and nature, it's really everywhere in our lives. And we think that there's a lot of benefit to be gained by bringing all of these ideas together, all of the important work that our community is doing, bringing those messages together in a clearinghouse for people to see, to experience, to get involved with. And so this Act for Ealing is coming soon. We've got some feelers out to organizations now, and we are trying to sort of build that initial coalition. But stay tuned for this, because this is going to be, it's not necessarily an Ealing Council-owned idea. We are a seat at this table of all of the people that are taking action on climate change within the borough. And finally, I just wanted to mention that that third piece of the pie around industry and commercial, we also have a little bit of activity around this. You'll see that the strategy is largely silent on what we're able to do with industry and commercial right now, but we have managed to get a place in the Design Council's program to help us develop out a program to engage with businesses on addressing their carbon emissions. So this is in its infancy as well. It just started in November, but by May, we should have a model that we will hopefully get some funding for in order to help engage the business community around reducing their carbon emissions and contributing to our overall carbon neutral target for 2030. So those are just some initial ideas around engagement. One of the key commitments that we have in the strategy is that we need to produce a full communications and engagement plan around this, because it is so critical that we get all of these audiences pulling together.
Thank you, Jo. Thank you for bringing that in. One of the external expert witnesses who couldn't attend was Jane Fernley from Ealing Parks Foundation, and she sent her apologies, but I think her comment is particularly relevant to this section. her comment was, she sent her apologies, but she did say, and this is what she said: I would like to commend the climate change team for the approach they have taken in consulting local residents and expert organisations in developing the strategy and action plan. This is a great initiative and of course very timely. I would urge the council to widen the scope of the strategy in an early next step, engaging residents, businesses and other organisations to commit in a similar way so that the total impact is much greater. If this is done in a similar way, inclusive manner, I am sure it will be successful. So that's Jane's comments there. I mean, it strikes me the success of this is very much about how we get people to engage in their private lives and make different living decisions. There was, I think it was the Climate Assembly UK had a comment about after COVID, what did individuals want their government, employers and others to do? And 93% strongly or very strongly supported change to help combat climate and go towards climate change and go towards a net zero outcome. There was only 4% disagreed or strongly approved. But interestingly, that question was government and employers and others. It didn't say about the individual. So I wonder if that answer would have been a bit different. So I think this is a key part of how we make this a success. So Councillor Chauhan has another commitment. So she's just let me know that she will need to make a move, and I'm conscious of the time, but if we've got other people to feed in, and we're lucky we've got councillors from North Ealing, West Ealing, and also over in the east side of the borough, so from all different aspects of the borough. So, and obviously Ealing Transition and Mary had that role to play. So do we have any sort of comments or feedback into this, please? It would be good, perhaps. I wonder how different communities are going to be engaged, because it'd be interesting to see how it might be different in the east in Chiswick, it might be different in Southall, it might be different in the north of the borough, how we're actually going to get people to come along, because some of these are going to be like making their change or being that role of influence of the council. And that's a tough call. We've got the communications that we have, either social media, print media around Ealing, Ealing Extra, but how are we going to actually get some very personal decisions of how people lead their lives, whether to insulate homes, the cost of that, how are we going to engage with that? That's a tough nut to crack, rather than making policy in a room in the council in Percival House and enacting that policy. This is a difficult thing. So any thoughts that people have on that would be really helpful. There's a little bit of a pause here.
Well, can I just chip in there, Chair?
Buttersall, yes.
When it comes to communicating this on a campaigning level, and this is where politics will interject slightly, is that I've always found social media is great, but that needs to be in addition with the paper format, and the paper format needs to be ongoing. Like with all communication, it needs to be ongoing. You can't just do a leaflet on something and then, you know, then you don't hear anything anymore. You need to keep reminding people of what's happening all the time. And I think that is where a lot of companies, even political parties, tend to fail, is the communication is just not ongoing. So my two things is most of the communication needs to be in paper format, and I would try to be green here, but as long as the paper can be recycled, then that's fine. That is the method that works the most. And Chair, you'll probably know this from your side as well. And Councillor Young as well, you know, from the three political parties. And the other thing is, it needs to be ongoing.
Sure. Mary, I could see you sort of shaking your head, so I'm just going to, and I think Trevor's indicating as well. So
from the local political issues going on currently, there's been a lot of criticism about leaflets coming, unwanted leaflets coming through the door. So I don't know if there's a change in people, you know, those pieces of paper have got to be valuable and telling people important things and not really wasteful. That's the only thing that I see with the leafleting.
Sure.
Can I just chip in again there, Paul?
Sure.
Yeah, when it comes to leaflets and people saying, oh, there's too many leaflets and so on and so forth, I hear this all the time on a political level as a campaigner too. I hear this all the time. And when people are telling you that there's all these leaflets coming through the door, there's too many leaflets and so on and so forth, that's when you know it's working.
Just to help, Mary did say useful information on anything printed, and the key is useful. Useful, relevant. Trevor, you were indicating.
Well, just that I think we ought to have something to say at Ealing Transition. We've been engaging the community for the last 11 years, and I think relatively successfully, not everywhere and not everybody. But I think what's important is that people are it's not just about information, it's about opportunity to connect and engage in activity. Mm-hmm. And that actually needs people. It doesn't need paper, it needs people. So I think it's, Joe was mentioning the Act for Ealing hub that we're hoping to kind of create, but it's kind of connecting people together and for people finding each other and finding the person in their street or in their neighborhood who they can do something with. So it needs to connect people together. That's what we've done. That's what the Transition Town movement's really been doing all along. It started with a bunch of people knocking on each other's doors saying, come and have a conversation about what we can do in our community at the cafe at the end of the road on Saturday. And we've been going ever since. So I think it needs some initiatives. That's why we've still got initiative in our name, because we feel that we're never done. We always have to be taking initiatives. But it's about connecting people together, and it means human activity, not just papers and emails.
Sure. Thank you, Trevor. I've got Councillor Martin, then Mary again. Yep.
I think actually Trevor's just said it much more eloquently than I can, but I really like the slide that had the Act for various options on it, because I think that starts to engage people, or can engage people in different areas where they have particular interest, and that's how you're probably going to get them involved if there's an aspect of it that they're already connected to. But essentially, I think what we need to try and encourage is organic growth, and some of the organisations are existing in Ealing already are doing a fantastic job. It's possible that they don't have a widespread across all aspects or all areas of the borough, and sort of trying to encourage that development in some of the other wards. For example, my own ward in Northolt West End, I think is something I certainly want to think about. But yeah, I'm not an expert in this area, but what Trevor said was pretty much along the lines I was thinking myself. That's it. Thank you.
Sure. Mary, you were going to come back in again?
Yeah, I was. The other thing was I was thinking about, I don't know if the group is aware of Lager Can, which is the rubbish collection group. And I think they've grown, although it was started on social media, I think their visibility, they've been in parks litter picking, and people see them litter picking and they're like, oh, who are they? And they join in. There's an organisation called Hubbub, which they've worked with Leeds Council about trying to encourage recycling in the town, and they came up with Leeds by example, and that's about street waste and getting people to recycle their street kind of disposable waste. And so Hubbub does it in a way that's visible on the street. You know, there's ones where people go into the park, they do litter picking. You get, if you bring your recycling, they give you a free cup of coffee. So I think paper's good, but there's other ways of being visible and not on social media.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think just to reinforce the lager can, I was at a lager can event last weekend, and just people seeing you do it, they get curious and ask and say, how do I get in touch and what's the contact details? And, you know, demonstration is a good way of learning, and people sort of get inspired to connect there. And I actually, and with Evening Transition, there's a few dark evenings I found a lot of soul and solace and uplifting spirits. Ironically, in a church in St Mary's, where you've had lots of meetings, but you know, having those opportunities to engage, I suppose what's not the problem, but the challenge is to engage those who are connected and feel an empathy with the themes are good, but to connect to those who are less invested, have got an interest, to those who are, it's a harder and tougher job, and that's for all. It's not just for this area, it's for all areas. But it almost becomes a common sense, like, I don't know, it might be a bad analogy, but the smoking ban. Who would have thought that if you went to somebody's house now and just lit a cigarette, people would be horrified. If you did that 20 years ago, they'd be looking for the ashtray to pass to you as you sat down. But not there's any law that you can't smoke in somebody's house, but how our attitudes have changed. And it does give us some hope that there becomes a common sense and an attitudinal change that people just accept now, but we need that attitudinal change to be in a different area. Probably a bad association, but I'm thinking about how there is hope for how people do accept a change and think differently and question differently. So I think we should take solace in that. I'm very conscious of the time, so it'd be good to get any sort of, I can see Mary and Councillor Martin's hand is still up. I don't know if that's a bit of a legacy.
Sorry, I'll take that down.
It's okay, just checking. I don't know if anybody's got any concluding or sort of final comments, and just checking that people got that opportunity.
Can I just...
Yeah, sorry. Councillor Martin, yeah.
Can I just say, I think it's been a great meeting, and I really appreciate all the contributions that everybody has made.
Yeah, it's really great to Paul. It's a really good meeting. We had a lot to learn and a lot to contribute. Thank you.
Well, can I thank everybody else, the external people coming in, Mary and Trevor and Joe, for being very much on the hot seat this meeting. Can I give you a bit of the summary that I've got on some of the themes? I mean, planning came out initially at the beginning. It would be good to tie up what we have as a local plan, because there's discussions about Ealing's local plan, to make sure that what we have as our local plan, because that's what planning decisions will reference, ties into our aims in climate change. Sitting here now, I don't know what scope is that and how much leeway we have within the parameters of the national planning framework, but as far as possible, we should be pushing what's achievable with our planning policy, feeds in with our climate policy. And I know there's ongoing discussions about Ealing's local plan going on at the moment. The workplace parking levy, that could be very controversial, but it'd be good to see that. Can employers see a benefit that their workforce can gain from? Peter made the point that there is a tension there in Hounslow. Well, where are we going to think about doing in Ealing? How are we going to demonstrate that there is that positive connection, which I think it would be good to put in there. I'm looking at my scribbled notes, so my apologies. The ongoing, the mutual secondary, not secondary benefits, that's a bad phrase, but the consequential benefits should be also a selling point of a lot of what we're doing. And that needs to be pushed as well, because there is a positive factor that comes out of improvements and changes that for the climates. There are other positive factors as well. So those consequential secondary factors should be also a selling point. And the communication and events, making sure the act of doing is seen as being prevalent as far as possible and to be pushed to the fore. And I think showing those examples of, I know there's an example of a house near on the Trees Estate, which is a great point about how we have sustainability on converting an existing structure and how we make it more for this forward-looking climate challenge. So where we can show change and action and achievability, those are part of our communication is going to be key, I think, going forward. I know Joe was looking for some steers in terms of the strategy, so that would be some of the things I'm taking. If I'm missing anything from the meeting, by all means, people please chip in there. I mean, I'll do Joe an email just to summarize that. I know she's not looking to rewrite the whole strategy from this meeting, but there are some of the points that I can think of, and I don't think they're far off the mark of where we are, but I think some of those points here. Joe, do you have any sort of thing that you need to say there in conclusion? Or anything?
I just agree that it was great to have your feedback. I do have a few hours tomorrow to finalize the strategy, so I'll take the feedback that I get. But it's been a great conversation, and really more than anything, it's a starting place for, you know, the long conversation ahead, really. So and thank you so much to our guests, especially for all the contributions, not just in the meetings that we've had along these lines, but for everything you're doing for the community. It's really the most critical stuff, really. So thank you.
All right. So on that note, can I thank everybody for coming in and chipping in with all their comments and being very active in that very active meeting. It was a huge topic to do, and we did overstep the mark in terms of time. So can I thank the Democratic Services officers who are still here, and Joe for her time, and everybody else for putting it in. So if any of the councillors have got comments about the themes for the future meetings, if you can send them to me. Councillor Chohan gave me some comments in the chat, which I've taken a note of. So if there's anything, and then that we can build that into the plannings of future meetings, that would be really helpful. But I can thank you all for your time here, and thank you for a lively meeting and going through a huge challenge for the future, but one that we're going to really have a go at and get ahead on. So thank you for everything. Thank you for your time this evening. Thank you very much. And thank you, Joe, for the hotspot this evening. Thank you very much for all the efforts and things that you're doing. All right.
Thank you, Jay.
Thank you.